This part of the lecture, we are going to discuss the different lines of the myofascial net. And there are 4 different lines. The first one that we're going to discuss is the superficial back line. And the primary reason and function of the superficial back line is so that we can maintain erect posture. In other words, so that we can stand up straight. Right? And so the myofascial line for the superficial back line is actually representative in this picture by that red drawing. So essentially all it does is it connects that entire back of the body all the way from the bottom of the feet, right? That plantar surface of the toes, all the way back up through the back of the body, through the front of the head into that frontal bone on the forehead. Okay? And so when we're thinking about training the superficial back line, what we really want to think of is driving the body into flexion. So if we're going to drive the body into flexion, that movement pattern, we know we're going to be working that superficial back line. So I have an example here, and this is basically looking at, if you look at this figure, what this woman is doing is getting into kind of a TRex squat / hinge, right? And so the setup is you have their feet or your client's feet about hip width, shoulder width apart. They're facing towards the anchor of any suspension trainer system. Their arms are at the chest and their knees are slightly bent. Okay, so all they're doing is driving the hips back while maintaining the same knee flexion. Allow the body to fall into the hips and then returning to that starting position once you reach any point of first tension. Okay, so essentially what you see with this movement is what we just discussed. In order for us to work the superficial back line, we need to drive the body into flexion. Okay, and that's exactly what's happening into this movement. Okay, you're going to feel this in your erectors, your lats, and your glutes, your hamstrings, and your calves. You can add a progression here to lift the toes. Okay, so again, really important that you know and you think when we're training the myofascial line, specifically the superficial back line, we are driving the body into flexion. So any movement pattern that drives the body into flexion is going to be training the superficial back line. Now let's talk about the second myofascial line, and that is the superficial front line. So if the back line was everything connecting the back of the body, right, the myofascial system connecting the back of the body, the superficial front line is exactly the opposite. So it connects the top of the toes all the way in front of the body through the pubic bone into the side of the skull. And you can kind of see that in this visual, kind of comes up right through here. Okay, the primary function, again, of the superficial front line is to maintain posture. So we know that the superficial back and superficial front line, both the primary function is to maintain posture, right, and to have an erect posture. What's different is that the superficial front line drives the body into extension, whereas the superficial back line drove the body into flexion. Okay, so if we're thinking about movement patterns that drive the body into extension, this is a nice example. Okay, so essentially what you see is this person in kind of like a slight lunge with a slight back extension. Okay, the setup again, start with your feet hip shoulder width apart. You're taking a step forward while driving the pelvis forward, but at the same time, simultaneously, you're lifting your hands and arms up and moving them backwards into an overhead reach. Focusing on driving the front knee towards the front while keeping the trunk erect and then coming back to that starting position. Okay, a regression from that exercise is already starting in that staggered stance, rather than starting from the front with feet together and stepping forward. You can actually make it a little bit easier by already starting in that staggered stance. Okay, so you're taking away the step. You can progress it because you can add looking at your kind of upper body while you're doing this movement. So it's going to be easier visually, right, if you do this movement and you're looking forward versus if you take your head and you look up. Okay, so that's the difference. So again, really important that we know the superficial back line is going to work on flexion. So any movement pattern that's flexion is working on the superficial front line. Any movement that involves extension is going to work on the superficial front line. Now let's look at the lateral lines. The primary function of the lateral lines is to maintain stability during lateral and rotational movement. Okay, so basically anytime we can drive the body laterally, we're going to be incorporating our lateral myofascial lines. Okay, and again, you can see in this visual, the myofascial line connects the side of the body from the midpoint of the foot. So you can see laterally on that malleolus, okay, all the way up to the lateral side of the leg, the trunk and the shoulders, to the side of the skull. Okay, so again, what the lateral myofascial lines do is drive our body laterally. So if we want to work our lateral lines, we need to move in a lateral way. Here is an example. Okay, so you can see this woman with dumbbells, she's kind of standing hip width apart, and you can see her reaching over and engaging those lateral lines. Okay, and again, so important. Yes, we always think about muscles, but this is the myofascial lateral line that we are specifically working on. So the setup is feet width apart, dumbbells at shoulder height, and then you extend, the knees are flexed, and then as you press up, you move laterally and you drive your hips into that opposite arm or opposite direction. You follow the dumbbells with your eyes. You can see this woman looking at the dumbbells, and then you come back to a started position. You can regress this by only doing one arm at a time, and you can progress this by starting on one foot with one foot crossed over the other. So rather than having that kind of equal feet width apart, you actually have one foot crossed over the other. So again, really important that you know that the lateral lines are going to drive, in order to work the lateral lines, you want to drive the body laterally. Spiral lines are a little bit different, right? The primary function of spiral lines is to help control any type of rotational movement and to drive the body into those rotational movements. And you can see the lines, they loop around the sides of the body. It kind of looks like an 8, right? A figure 8. And it goes from the front to the back, all the way down through the core, from top to bottom, okay, on both sides. So in order to work our spiral lines, we need to drive the body in rotation. And it's important that you know that lateral is different than rotation. Okay, so again, in order to work spiral lines, we need to do movement patterns that include rotation. Here's an example. It looks very similar to what you just saw with the lateral lines, but this time, in addition to going lateral, you actually see rotation. So again, you start by having feet width apart, dumbbells at shoulder height, and both knees flexed. Slightly flexed. Then, while pressing overhead with those dumbbells, you pivot the foot internally, and that allows you to rotate. You keep the big toe on the ground, and then you kind of look up and back towards those dumbbells in a rotated pattern. You can regress this again, starting with one foot already internally rotated. So rather than doing the movement pattern from start to rotated movement, you actually already start with a foot rotated. You can progress by adding a rotational step in the same direction as the overhead press. So you can actually step, right? So this woman would actually be stepping with her left foot towards her dumbbells. So again, really important that you know all 4 lines. So right now I want you to stop and pause, and you can write this down or just think it to yourself. What are the 4 different myofascial lines? And then how can we work those different myofascial lines? Do we need to drive them into extension or flexion or rotation or lateral movements? You need to know all 4 and how we can utilize movement patterns to engage those myofascial lines. The next thing we're going to discuss is getting the most out of your myofascial training, and that will be in the next short lecture.